Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish news syndicate JNS.org, and you are listening to Top Story with Jonathan Tobin, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in the Jewish world. And each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Well, this week, we might have talked about the ongoing inability of American Jewry to respond effectively to anti-Semitism driven by hate and delegitimization of Israel, or the strategic situation in the Middle East. But instead, we're going to be discussing a potential political earthquake that may be about to happen in Israel. The very real possibility that a bizarre left-right coalition led by Naftali, Bennett, and Yair Lapid might soon be formed, which will be the end of the prime ministership of Benjamin Netanyahu after 12 consecutive years in office. To discuss what exactly is going on, will it happen, and what it would mean both for Israel and for the U.S. Israel relationship, we have with us today JNS Jerusalem Bureau Chief Alex Traiman. Great. Well, as I said, we're in the perhaps in the days before a potential political earthquake in Israel, with the coalition of change or government of change seeming to be a possibility, or a very real possibility right now. The question is, do you think it's going to happen? And if so, what it's going to mean? Let's tackle first what exactly is going on right now.
Okay, well, first of all, just want to comment and say that we've been in a political earthquake in Israel for the last 3 years. So it's been a sustained situation of nonstop tremors. And though it's been sustained, it is seemingly unsustainable to the public. And that is what has led Naftali Bennett to defect from the right-wing alliance with Benjamin Netanyahu and announce his intention to form a government together with Yair Lapid and some of the other parties that have committed themselves to ending Netanyahu's seemingly endless 12-year consecutive rule. Despite those intentions and the statements that Bennett made, there still is not a clear majority of Knesset members that are ready to unseat Netanyahu. So despite the fact that Bennett has officially defected from Netanyahu's camp, doesn't necessarily make a government. Right now, the parties that are aligned with this changed group would total 58 members of the Knesset. However, at least one member of Naftali Bennett's own Yamina party is currently sitting as a rebel, unwilling to vote in favor of the Change Alliance, specifically because Naftali Bennett promised the entire Israeli public explicitly that he would not sit in any coalition together with Yair Lapid, stating that he, Naftali Bennett, was right while he, Yair Lapid, was left, and said that he wouldn't sit in a rotation agreement with Yair Lapid, whether Yair Lapid would be first or Naftali Bennett would be first. In fact, he even went on a national news program and signed a piece of paper in a stunt and held it up to the camera saying, "I will not sit in a government together with Yair Lapid." And he has gone back on that promise.
I should interrupt for just a minute. That does not make Bennett the only person to break a promise. Netanyahu has, he was in his speech on Sunday, Netanyahu highlighted that very point. But of course, Netanyahu has broken his word to coalition partners and the public on a lot of things again and again, too. I mean, they're all hypocrites.
You're exactly right. And that's exactly the reason why so many former allies of Benjamin Netanyahu are now sitting in a changed camp. You have people like Avigdor Lieberman, who sat together with Netanyahu for years. Gideon Sa'ar, a member of Netanyahu's own Likud party, who broke away and took several members of the Likud with him to form the New Hope Party. And now Bennett and his colleague Ayelet Shaked from inside the Yamina party are just two of the latest defectors that used to sit with Netanyahu. However, those that are claiming that Israel needs a changed government are making those claims specifically because they're tired of the type of governance that Netanyahu has led Israel with over the past 12 years, specifically that type of governance of breaking promises to the public. And yet now you have somebody that's coming in making the exact same move that a Netanyahu would make in order to unseat Netanyahu, which is poetic justice, of course, but it doesn't represent a real change from the governance that you had with Netanyahu, and you're getting someone that doesn't necessarily have, depending on who you ask, half the skill set of Netanyahu, but is still willing to entertain those same types of shenanigans, and that's what you're getting instead.
Well, I think that's, I think what you say is absolutely true. But also what Bennett said was also true. The only alternatives before the Israeli public right now are this ramshackle coalition of left and right or another election, a fifth election inside of 2+ years. And, I think all these various parties and politicians, they're all calculating something. They might do better in a fifth election. Some would do worse. There is good reason to believe that Bennett and Shaked might be punished by their voters for their dalliance with Lapid. On the other hand, we really don't know. It's more likely than not that even another election would not produce a very different result. Netanyahu has gone to election after election in the hope of changing things, to finally getting back to having a majority. And he's falling short every time. The last time when we spoke on a JNS webinar on election day in Israel, at a point where it looked like the exit polls were showing that Netanyahu would have that majority, it was like, yes, he's a wizard, but he fell he fell short. It didn't work out. And so he's, now it's in that situation where it's going to be this or nothing. And I think it's reasonable to conclude, and I think you even alluded to it in your first statement, that the optimal result for Netanyahu is just to keep the stalemate going as long as possible. He's kind of enjoyed being the permanent, temporary prime minister of Israel these last 2 years. He's worked very well. He doesn't have to worry about coalition partners. He can basically do what he wants. And in fact, it gave him, over the course of the last year, it was arguably maybe his best year ever in terms of accomplishments with handling the coronavirus pandemic better than seemingly any other country in the world, and the Abraham Accords, which seemed to break the mold and really change the strategic situation and diplomatic situation for Israel. And yet, as you also alluded to, the Israeli public doesn't like this. And, for good reason. They want an actual government. They want a budget passed. And I think it's fair to say a majority, or at least a narrow majority, are sick of Benjamin Netanyahu after 12 years and all of his shenanigans and everything that goes with the whole Netanyahu business, whether it's the corruption trial, which I think you and I both agree is on flimsy charges, but nevertheless, it's a trial ongoing against the sitting prime minister. So it's kind of in that situation where it's this or nothing. Now, of course, it doesn't happen. We shouldn't assume that it will happen until it does happen. Right now, the news is full of various coalition disputes within this government of change. They're all fighting over offices and patronage, as is the case with in any democracy and in any coalition. But the question is, if it does happen, what will it, what kind of a government would it actually mean? I mean, Netanyahu and certainly Netanyahu's supporters are screaming it'll be a left-wing government, it'll be terrible, it'll destroy the strategic situation. Is that really true, or will it be, as every past quote-unquote unity government in Israel's history, be a government of paralysis, a government not able to do that much, really, for either the left or the right?
Well, it's a question if this is the only other option aside from another election. I certainly agree with you that if there's no changed government, that the most likely scenario it would be another election. However, it's not the only possible solution. You have to remember that if Naftali Bennett would promise to sit with Netanyahu, then the right-wing bloc of ideologically aligned parties would have 59 seats, which is already one more seat than the Change bloc currently has. And really, you could say that with 59 seats of ideologically aligned party members, and then looking into the Change bloc and recognizing that there are another as many as 13 seats from the New Hope Party, 12 seats rather, from the New Hope Party and from Lieberman's party that are ideologically right-wing, that all it would take is one or two defectors from that party to go sit with the ideological camp and form a government. Now, like you said, the likelihood of that is very limited. And Netanyahu had been trying to recruit members to defect from the Change bloc back into the camp and failed to do so, which is why Bennett said there's no option for a right-wing government. Now, by not having a right-wing government and taking the Likud party, which has 30 seats, by far the largest party of any in the government, and moving them into the opposition together with the religious parties, which themselves are another 16 seats, you don't have what Netanyahu is calling a left-wing government. And the reason why it's not a left-wing government is because the left wing does not comprise that much of the Israeli electorate. However, you do have all the members of Israel's left wing in the government to the far side, which includes the far left Meretz party, which includes the Labor Party, the once proud Labor Party, which includes the Yesh Atid party, and the Blue and White Party, which are all to the center left of the spectrum. And in addition to having all the left-wing members of Knesset in that government, you're also going to be relying on the outside support from the Ra'am party, led by Mansour Abbas. And the Ra'am party, in its charter, is a member of the southern branch of the Islamic movement, essentially a sister organization of Hamas. And the even more extreme joint list of Arab parties, which has another 6 seats. So you do have this government will rely on as far left as you can possibly go, and you're leaving out the proud ruling party of the Likud, the party that got by far and away the most votes of any party in the election, plus the religious parties, which have supported Netanyahu for this extended period.
I think that's all true. I think the defectors, I think it's pretty clear there aren't going to be any defectors, or if they had been, Netanyahu would have gotten them in the weeks and months that preceded this. I think it's also true that if there was going to be a narrow right-wing government, it was going to have to depend on Ra'am and Mansour Abbas too. I mean, that was the whole point. That was indeed the whole point of Netanyahu's outreach to Arab voters, and the fact that Abbas was, this Abbas, not the Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority, that he was willing to just accept patronage and to be, to some extent, like a normal political party rather than an opposition to Israel's existence, even though, as you rightly say, that's what his party is about. So Netanyahu is going to have to depend on Mansour Abbas and Ra'am too. The question is, is it a narrow? Will it work? Now, of course, the person who prevented that from happening, from Netanyahu forming a narrow government with Abbas's permission, is not Naftali Bennett. It's Bezalel Smotrich. What's fascinating about this is that Netanyahu continues to attack Bennett. In fact, throughout this entire process, his focus has been on basically demonizing and abusing and doing his best to persuade/intimidate Bennett, when in fact the person who prevented him from forming that government was Smotrich, not Bennett. Now, that's also interesting because in some ways Smotrich is Netanyahu's poodle. He was he's in the Knesset because of Netanyahu. Netanyahu went to great lengths to get that party, the National Religious Party, into the Religious Zionist Party, into the Knesset, guaranteeing its spots within Likud, and making a deal between him and the neo-Kahanis faction on the far right. So, but it was Smotrich who did this all along, and it was Smotrich's main goal is to destroy Bennett, because he wants to be the king of the parties to the right of Likud. It's all very complicated.
You're right about it, so there's a few things. First of all, Smotrich probably would have gotten into the Knesset even without the alliance with what you call the neo-Kahanists, because they bring to the table about 1.5 votes, and the party has 6 votes. So the traditional, what you call the National Union that really Smotrich represents of the religious Zionist alliance, would have passed the threshold likely on its own. And the reason why they would have passed the threshold on their own is because Naftali Bennett has over and over again really spit in the face of his own religious Zionist following. In fact, there's a poll right now in which that came out today that said that over 61% of the people that voted for Bennett disapprove of the merger together, the alliance with Lapid, and that a majority even would prefer a 5th election over the government with Lapid. So in terms of Bennett's own voters, he's lost those voters, and many of them have gone towards Smotrich. And the reason why Smotrich refused to sit with the Arab party is specifically that in a future election, Bennett is going to find himself without a camp, because he's abused his camp over and over again. Now, what you rightly point out is that by Smotrich's refusal to sit even with outside support from the Ram party, which means that the Ram party doesn't even have to join the coalition. They only have to support it from the outside, that instead of getting a far-right government that Bennett himself would have been willing to join, that would have had a narrow minority of 59 seats out of 120, which would have been all the way to the right and would have enabled Netanyahu and all the right-wing partners to advance all of their coalition agendas. By not relying on Ram's support for that, what you're going to get is a minority government that includes the entire left wing of Israel's political spectrum, supported on the outside by Ram. And either way, it is worth noting that Ram is turning out to be the kingmaker in an Israeli Jewish government.
Yeah, it's deeply ironic. In some ways, in a historic sense, if we recall what Jabotinsky wrote about a Jewish state incorporating Arabs into the government, and he even went so far as to saying the vice premier of a putative Jewish state, writing many years before the state of Israel was actually established, should be an Arab. So there are some people who approve of that. There's another, ironically, as much as the religious Zionist voters are not happy about Netanyahu being ousted in this putative coalition that Bennett is enabling, if Bennett, at some point in the next couple of weeks, is sworn in and prime minister, this would be it would be historic in another way, in that he would be the first observant Jew, the first Jew with a kippah on his head, first Jewish man with a kippah on his head to serve as prime minister, as well as the son of American immigrants. That's really, it shows Israel has come a long way from its, from the many years when it was dominated by labor and the left, and which the religious population was very much marginalized. I think that's one factor to take into this. But again, if it's all happening, it's also happening because Netanyahu, what he said when he spoke after Bennett spoke, he talked about the deal that he offered his two putative partners that would have created a majority coalition, namely to New Hope and Gideon Sa'ar, and to Bennett, that they could each serve as prime minister with him in a three-way, there would be, a tripartite, a triumvirate, sort of like ancient Rome and Caesar and Pompey, ruling Israel, serving in turn as prime minister, which, as Netanyahu rightly said, really made no sense. But Sa'ar wouldn't do it. Sa'ar wouldn't do it, even though Netanyahu said he would go first, because Sa'ar believed that Netanyahu would find a way for it not to happen, that it was just a way to run out the clock on Lapid. And, I think as much as we can get deep into the weeds of the politics of the parties and the personalities, and I think, it's kind of fascinating. If you're a political junkie of Israeli politics, this is a lot to dig into. But I think if in fact this coalition happens, and I think the odds are slightly in favor of it happening, because it's in the interest of the people who will sign up to actually do it one way or the other. It's kind of like a Greek tragedy in terms of Netanyahu, because this is a man, as you rightly said, none of his competitors have his talents, have his experience, have his gravitas. Poll after poll show that at least a plurality of Israelis think he's the best man for the job, still after 12 years, in spite of being sick of him with some respect. But we are all humans, and it's sort of a staple of Greek tragedy that we are felled by our flaws. And among Netanyahu's flaws is that nobody trusts him. He drove people out of the Likud. Bennett and Shaked were both part of his own bureau. Lieberman was. Sa'ar was one of the leading members of the Likud. And it's not just that he basically targeted anybody who could be a successor. It's that nobody trusts him. And, that's where we started. That's where this kind of goes to. And it's if we are on the cusp of the end of the Netanyahu era, then I think it's deeply sad to think that with all of his talents, he's going to be undone by a personality trait that he should have learned that really he just can't seem to correct.
Yeah, absolutely. You would think that after failing to form a government after 3 consecutive elections and now going to a 4th consecutive election and still being unable to form a government, there certainly was an option where Netanyahu could have removed himself from the equation. And if he would have removed himself from the equation, there's no doubt that you could have a very, very strong and secure right-wing government that would include the Likud, that would include the New Hope Party led by Gideon Sa'ar, that would include the Yamina Party, that would potentially include the Yisrael Beitenu Party. You would have over 70 seats that would include the right-wing and religious parties. And I'll even take it one further. In a few days' time, Israel is going to have a legislative election to select the next president of Israel. And it's going to be a vote between Isaac Herzog, the former head of the Labor Party, and Miriam Peretz. Now, if Benjamin Netanyahu would have turned around to the Knesset and said, I will step out of the seat of the prime minister in order to enable the next up in the Likud to form a real right-wing government with all the members that should belong to a right-wing government, if you will vote for me to be the president of Israel, where he could then move down the block, would no longer have to work with the parliament, could continue to act in a ceremonial capacity to brand Israel's image, improve Israel's image, meet with world leaders, fly on the jet, go to Davos, do all those things, and serve Israel. Then he could have been the prime minister for 15 years, plus president for 7 years. Nobody could have gotten him out of that position. Nobody would have given him a hard time. And then you would have a Netanyahu in that capacity as president, plus leaving behind a strong right-wing government. But because he was so committed to the chair of prime minister, that instead of turning the government over to a successor in the large 30-seat Likud party, he's turning the mandate over to Yair Lapid, and the prime minister of Israel is going to be the leader of a party with 7 seats. And I think that's even more tragic. Considering that there was a golden parachute available, how much more tragic it actually is.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think even the last day or two, Yisrael Katz, one of the leading ministers in the Likud government, said that he had suggested this to Netanyahu. Now, of course, Katz wanted to be the successor. He's not alone. There's a long line of people who want to be the guy after Netanyahu in the Likud, including people who are outside of the party. I think both Bennett and Shaked would like to be that person, feel that would be the more natural position for them.
if you would have went in that direction, okay, and Netanyahu had that opportunity, he could have constructed all kind of deals to, let's say, bring the New Hope Party, which is a party of Likud defectors who oppose Netanyahu, back into the Likud party. The Yamina party, Bennett and Shaked, they want to be part of the Likud party. He could have brought them into the Likud party. Then you could have a ruling Likud party of 43 seats, something like that. And then you could have held a snap primary to figure out who will be the next leader of the Likud. So, when you said in the beginning that the only other option between this changed government is another election, it's really not true, because ultimately the parliament is the one who decides who's the prime minister. And while the parliament is sick of sitting with Netanyahu, the parliament can figure out any kind of alignment that it wants in order to make a government. And there's lots of different ways you can go when you want to start being creative and think about what's best for the country.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. The point is, in order for that to happen, Netanyahu had to be willing to let go, to move. He and the family needed to move out of Balfour Street, the house on Balfour Street. And he was absolutely opposed to that. He wanted to go on being prime minister, period. He wanted to be the guy in charge. And he would not consider he clearly didn't consider for a minute that very rational option, which would have, as you say, secured his legacy. Again, a tragic mistake and a tragic flaw on his part, for all of his smarts and his skills.
Well, Netanyahu's opponents succeeded, in making it only about Netanyahu, and that includes the trials, which, as you mentioned, are potentially dubious. But when they become what's on the news day in and day out, they just make it more and more about Netanyahu. And instead of Netanyahu being able to rise above that somehow or another, and he was probably the most capable of any of the candidates to do that, he actually doubled down and went along with them and made it about himself more and more and more. And the more he made it about himself, the more allies he lost. And ultimately, even though the voters of this country do, I think by a large margin, still prefer Netanyahu to any other candidate. And honestly, it's not even close. The parliament is just sick and tired of working with him, and they're the ones that are pushing him out.
Not the first time it's happened. Netanyahu is right when he says the media is against him, when he says sort of the permanent bureaucracy. Deep state sounds conspiratorial, but every country has a permanent bureaucracy, which and certainly in Israel's case, and certainly in the United States case, it kind of tends to the left. And any conservative or somebody who's seen on the right has to deal with this in the United States as well as Israel. And I think certainly in American politics, conservatives have always had, sort of two choices. They could either be Nixon or Reagan. The country, the media and the establishment was against both. Nixon fumed and conspired and was taken down by his own, anger about the people against him. Reagan smiled and laughed at them and governed and succeeded. Alas, Netanyahu to some extent chose the Nixon route, and I think that's part of what's led us to this pass. Now, let's just step ahead, making the assumption that this Bennett Lapid government actually does get to, as you say, 58 plus the 4 that Ra'am will supply. Now, there are two interesting questions. I think that arise from that. How stable will it be, or how unstable will it be? And, I think the argument that it would be unstable is pretty much, it's very hard to argue against it. It's sort of a house divided against itself. How could it fail to be anything but a mess? Especially depending on a party that is totally against everybody left and right, their values. And yet I think there are two questions here that might argue against that as well. And I'd like you to answer, sort of take those on. One thing that would keep this government together would be the thing that brought it into being, Netanyahu. With Netanyahu in the opposition, with the possibility that breaking up the government would give Netanyahu another chance at power, will that be enough to discipline the members of the 58 plus 4 to stay in place and play nicely with each other? Second question, once it's in place, will at least one of the ultra-Orthodox parties decide that that loyalty to Netanyahu is not worth giving up all the money and patronage that they're giving up by being outside of the government? Because both of those parties, Shas and UTJ, really are in politics for the patronage, for the funding of all the things that they do. So do you think either of those factors will enable Bennett to serve 2 years as prime minister?
I think that, first of all, we've already seen that the changed government, it will do anything that it takes to keep Netanyahu from power. And the device that they've chosen, aside from this alignment, has been to put on the table various pieces of legislation that would invalidate Netanyahu from serving as prime minister. One, on the basis of term limits, which Netanyahu would have already retroactively exceeded. And two, on the basis of being unable to hold the position of prime minister while under trial or under indictment, which, by the way, is the law with regard to any other ministry, with the exception of the prime minister. So I think that if they do form a government, I would imagine that within the first weeks of the passage of that government would be such legislation that would essentially neutralize Netanyahu's ability to come back. Now, with regard to what might hold an unstable alliance together, right now, Yair Lapid is the one with the mandate. He has the second largest party at 17 seats. He is scheduled to become the prime minister as part of this arrangement midway through the term after 2 years and 3 months. So he wants this government to stay in power because he is on the clock to become the prime minister. Now, Naftali Bennett, as we mentioned before, has really hurt his own base. He's spat in the face of his own voters and placed himself in between the Likud and his own voters. And basically, he made a maneuver, which is, I guess, what you would refer to as like a shoot the moon type of maneuver, because there's no precedent for a leader of a party with 7 seats to somehow become the prime minister. But Bennett's gamble was that if he becomes the prime minister, that he will prove himself on the job, and then he will demonstrate to the Israeli public that they should have voted for him to be the prime minister to begin with. So his only ticket to be the prime minister right now is to hold this thing together. That gives Lapid and the left-wing members of the government a tremendous amount of leverage, because Bennett is in a position where he has no choice but to capitulate to them. And at the same time, Lapid also needs this government to become the prime minister later, which you would never have had a leader of a party with only 17 seats becoming the prime minister. So the coalition math of the agreement could potentially hold this thing together. At the same time, if this government does prove itself to be highly ineffective, and let's not kid ourselves about the types of threats that are facing Israel. I mean, we just saw what can break out here just 2 weeks ago, and the Gaza threat is probably the least of all the serious strategic threats facing the state of Israel today from a military perspective, when you consider Hezbollah in the north, Iran, the diplomatic pressure that Israel's under. So now, if Netanyahu is out of the picture and the Likud holds a snap primary and they select a new leader, and it becomes clear that that new leader could be better suited to lead the country, then you have a good chance of...
Can I just stop you on that? That's a question. Do you really think that Netanyahu is out of the picture? I mean, do you think that the legislation, I guess you're assuming that the new government will pass legislation saying he can't be prime minister, and that will force Likud to find a new leader. Benjamin Netanyahu screaming and kicking to the contrary.
Well, Netanyahu would have to he would have to regroup. It depends on what legislation they're able to pass, and it's not clear that just because they were able to pass a confidence vote in the government means that they would they would be able to pass legislation. In fact, a party in opposition, a strong party such as the Likud, could prevent lots of legislation from getting passed. However, this government is being formed specifically to get Netanyahu out of office, so its primary function is to make sure that Netanyahu doesn't get back. Now, if they do succeed in doing that, that's going to change the whole system. And you might even be able to, maybe even Bennett would defect out of this government with left-wing party partners and orchestrate some kind of jump back, maybe together with Gidon Sar and others, to form a right-wing government even without going to elections. And to do that, they would need the religious parties. And I think you asked a good question about whether or not the religious parties would eventually join this government. I think it would absolutely be in their best interest to join a government led by Bennett for a few reasons. Number one is then they would save the government from relying on the Arab votes, and the Ram party and the joint Arab list could wilter away in the opposition and no longer be the kingmakers of a government. So they could actually save this government from relying on the Arab parties. Number one. Number two, you have Avigdor Lieberman, who is ardently against the motives of the Haredi parties over the last several years, now going into the finance ministry potentially. And also Yair Lapid is against many of the policies of the religious parties. And if the religious parties are sitting in the opposition, that could enable a government to pass all kinds of legislation that would be against the religious party's interests.
Just turn off the spigot. In fact, by putting Lieberman at the finance ministry, Lapid has really put his foot on the throat of the Haredi parties.
Absolutely. So if they would make what I think would be a wise decision and actually go into such a government, and then make themselves the kingmakers, the ones that determine whether or not that government can pass a no confidence motion. I think that that's a significant amount of leverage that they might hold against the government from taking harsh actions against their own behavior. So I could see them going in because they're self-motivated, they're self-interested parties. So I think that that's possible.
I think it's very difficult. We could sort of game out all these scenarios. But perhaps what Bennett is thinking, or, perhaps counting on, and I think a lot of the people involved in this are counting on, that once Netanyahu is out of the picture, once he's no longer prime minister, and the assumption is once he's out of the prime ministership, he's not coming back. One way or another, it's going to be very hard for him ever to become prime minister again. That's kind of like a big bang. When in 2005, when Ariel Sharon broke up the Likud, seemingly destroying it, although not, as it turns out, in order to withdraw from Gaza, Israeli reporters, journalists, called that the Big Bang. I think the end of Netanyahu may be a more permanent Big Bang, in that it will scramble, the cards will be shuffled after he's gone in some ways that we can't even calculate exactly how it will turn out. And I think that's what Bennett wants. And it will change things, and it would, as much as we can sit here and speculate as to what it will mean, we don't know.
Right, and I think you're right also, and I think that's what Yair Lapid wants, because he's the one that would potentially have the right to be the prime minister if the Likud wouldn't be in charge. But the specific reason why he was willing to make the offer to Bennett to be the prime minister first is because he agrees with that assessment that the first goal is to get Netanyahu out. And if they feel like they need to get Bennett out later, well, they also think that it will be much easier to get Bennett out later than it would have been to unseat Netanyahu. So they were willing to let another right-winger, potentially someone claiming to be further to the right than Netanyahu, even to be the prime minister, because they calculate that they'd rather deal with Bennett at a later date than have to deal with Netanyahu, who's proven himself over the years to be a much tougher political opponent. I would like to suggest that there's some things that Bennett has done here, um, which are very clever and have have basically protected some of the key ministries and kept them, including the security cabinet, with right wing majority. So even though the right wing is not a majority in the coalition itself, in some key positions, which include the religious affairs ministry, which would go to the Yamina party, the justice ministry, which would go to the right wing Gidon Sar of the New Hope party, which include also keeping Benny right and keeping Benny Gantz as the defense minister, who was the defense minister under Netanyahu, and keeping majority within the security cabinet. That he's protecting some of the key interests that the right wing would have and would argue against going into government with the left, keeping those for the right. So to that extent, for those that do prefer a Netanyahu-led government and do prefer a right-wing government, this government is not necessarily an all-out disaster from the outset. And certainly there's a feeling inside Israel that the nation is strong, the foundations were strong, in large part due to many of the policies that Netanyahu carried for these last 12 years. And nobody's denying that. But that the country is strong enough to withstand the change of the guard. We've had all kind of unity alignments before, including with Netanyahu at the helm. And there's definitely a feeling inside the country that that we can get past this crisis, as we've gotten past many others, and that the country will continue to move on. And perhaps even there's a feeling that by allowing ministers to actually run their ministries, which Netanyahu was never really willing to do, that in a sense you might actually get some real legislation passed that will help the country to move forward in a way that's been stalled during these last 3 years when Netanyahu was running these transitional governments.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. It's not the end of the world, even for the people on the right. I think they should realize that. But that's a good segue to, I think, the other question that we should ask about this potential development. And that is, there are, the people rooting for the end of Netanyahu are not just in Israel. One of the people who are probably cheering the loudest for Bennett's decision were in the White House, and Joe Biden and the Biden administration. As much as President Biden has talked about his long friendship with Netanyahu, that's largely baloney, or malarkey, as President Biden would say. There's very little love lost between them. There's very little love lost between the entire Biden administration and the Netanyahu government. The Biden administration is almost totally made up of Obama administration alumni. They know that Netanyahu was the fiercest opponent of their chief foreign policy objective, which is getting back into the Iran nuclear deal, returning to a policy of appeasement and rapprochement with Iran, as well as much as even though Secretary of State Blinken conceded that there wasn't much chance for a peace process with the Palestinians, they want a rapprochement with the Palestinians as well. So the question is this government going to be able to say no to Biden as Netanyahu did? I'd suggest that it probably, as you alluded to, in the makeup of that security government, Biden would be foolish to assume it's going to be a pushover, because it has been, if the left and the right are sitting down together, it is a function of the fact that there is a broad consensus that stretches from the center left to the right, that there is no peace partner with the Palestinians and that Iran is a deadly threat. That there is a consensus on behalf of Netanyahu's policies. Now, there will be members of this government that do not subscribe to that consensus, and labor and Meretz. But I don't think Lapid and Gantz are interested in going down the road of saying yes to some of the things that Biden would want, certainly as far as Iran is concerned, or with the Palestinians. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that a lot of what the United States is trying to accomplish doesn't necessarily require Israel's approval, right? You can remember that Benjamin Netanyahu went to Congress in 2015 to oppose the Iran nuclear deal, and yet Netanyahu did not prevent the Iran nuclear deal from being signed, because these decisions are taken by the executive branch of the American government, and the Israeli government doesn't necessarily have too much leverage there. And so the argument that one can make, and the American government will certainly make, is that Benjamin Netanyahu made a critical mistake by going to Congress, arguing against the Iran nuclear deal, and they will blame the fracture in bipartisan support for Israel on Netanyahu himself. And they will encourage a new government not to make similar mistakes and to keep the differences that might be present between the two administrations quiet under the scenes. And so I do think that you're not going to see the type of opposition to U.S. policy that Netanyahu would have felt confident bringing to the table with an unstable and untested alliance like that of Bennett and Lapid.
Yeah, I think there's no question that Bennett and Lapid will be eager not to blow up the relationship with Biden right away. Now, you alluded to the 2015 speech before Congress. It was a great speech. And yet it didn't persuade anyone. And in fact, Obama used it as leverage to make the Iran deal a political litmus test, saying, Netanyahu insulted me. If you're a Democrat, you can't go along with this. I think blaming Netanyahu for the decline of the bipartisan consensus in favor of Israel is utter nonsense. That consensus has been, it has been blown up by the left wing of the Democratic Party and by Obama and by, to a certain extent by Biden as well, enabling and not confronting and not throwing, and not confronting people within his party who are open enemies of Israel, like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, who are in fact open anti-Semites. So that said, Bennett and Lapid may not be, will be looking to make nice with Biden, at least superficially, in terms of the openness and in terms of meetings. But I think it would be foolish to assume, certainly on the part of the United States, which, as you say, can do what it wants, but it makes it a lot harder if Israel is speaking up against things. And I think if the United States goes ahead, re-enters the Iran nuclear deal, as it has its power to do, as it's determined to do, Israel's not going to go along with it. Israel will protest. Even Bennett and Lapid will not be happy about it. And so I think anybody sort of in the United States, liberal critics of Netanyahu, Democrats who still hold grudges against the Likud, I think, for them to assume, oh, this is great, now our friends will be in power in Israel, I think that's really not true. So I think going forward, it doesn't change the strategic equation at all.
I would throw in that I don't think that Netanyahu's speech was a disaster, and I do think that it did convince one important party, and I think that party was these countries in the Gulf that are similarly against Iran. And I think that in many ways, the speech that Netanyahu made in the Congress, which was a bold speech, was one of the moves that led to the signing of the historic Abraham Accords. But I don't think that that Bennett and Lapid would be as bold as to go ahead and to do that. I do think that the Democrats are going to try to blame Netanyahu for the fracture in the relationship no matter what. I also think that the American Jewish communal leadership will try to get a reset with Israel and try to blame Netanyahu for the fracture that's been developing between the American Jewish community and the state of Israel. But I think that, like you were pointing out about the shift of the Democratic Party toward a more progressive agenda, that this same shift is also taking place within the American Jewish communal structure, which is in many ways operates as a mouthpiece of the Democratic Party when it comes to foreign policy. And so ultimately, you're going to see a lot of pressure from the American Jewish community on the state of Israel to go along with whatever the Biden administration is proposing, because they're going to think that now they can try to apply that leverage once again, and they're not going to be rebuffed as easily as they would have been rebuffed with Netanyahu in office.
I think that's true, but again, we'll have to see how that plays out. I think, as with predictions about what it will mean for Israel, what it will mean for the U.S. Israel relations, or even relations between Israel and American Jewry, there's still variables. We'll have to see. Anyway, Alex, thank you so much for joining me today on Top Story. It was great to have you on, and we'll hope to have you back again soon.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm really enjoying the podcast. Congratulations on getting it started, and I think that this is absolutely the right platform for you to continue to be spreading, I think, important wisdom, analysis, and observation on what's going on. So I'm very happy that the listeners have this podcast, and continue to look forward to whatever guest you're having on next.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Alex. Great having you on. And thanks so much to you for listening out there. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Top Story with Jonathan Tobin, which is brought to you by the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org. The Jewish News Syndicate is the fastest growing news agency covering Israel and the Jewish world the way you want it covered. We provide news, features, opinions, and analysis to as many as 100 print newspapers and digital publications every week, and you can log on every day to jns.org. Visit us there. And please follow and like this podcast on Amazon and Spotify and wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next week.